It was an ordinary day in the small town of Willow Creek. The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the houses, and the streets were calm with the gentle hum of summer. Children played outside, their laughter filling the air, while the adults went about their usual tasks. Among these people lived a quiet family. The father, John, worked at a local hardware store, and his daughter, Emma, spent most of her time reading books or helping around the house. They lived in a modest house at the end of a tree-lined street, far from the busy city life that many had come to know. John had always been a man of simple pleasures. He didn't care for the hustle and bustle of the outside world. His life had been about providing for his daughter, keeping her safe, and watching her grow into a bright young girl. They didn't need much more than that. They had their small house, their vegetable garden, and their quiet town. Life had always seemed peaceful, if a little uneventful. But John had come to appreciate the calm. There were days when he would look out over the horizon, staring at the endless fields, wondering what lay beyond. But those thoughts were rare and fleeting. One afternoon, just as John had finished his workday and was sitting on the porch enjoying a glass of iced tea, a strange sound broke through the familiar quiet of the day. It was faint at first, almost like the buzzing of an insect, but as it grew louder, John's curiosity was piqued. The sound wasn't normal. It didn't belong in Willow Creek. He stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans, and scanned the sky. There was nothing there, no birds, no planes, just the usual quiet. But then, something caught his eye. Far off in the distance, a strange light flickered in the sky. It wasn't a plane, nor a shooting star. It was something different. The light moved erratically, bouncing and weaving like it was struggling to stay in the air. John squinted, unsure of what he was seeing. The light grew brighter, and with a sudden burst, it seemed to descend rapidly towards the earth. A sharp noise followed, the sound of metal slicing through the atmosphere. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the light disappeared behind the trees at the edge of town. John's heart raced as he stood frozen in place. His mind tried to process what had just happened. Was it a plane crash? A falling satellite? It was hard to say, but one thing was certain. Something had happened, and it was close. He set the glass of iced tea down and began walking towards the tree line. Emma, who had been reading on the porch, saw her father move away and called out, "Dad?" "What's going on?" "I'm not sure, Emma." "Stay here," John said, his voice steady but with an edge of uncertainty. Emma didn't argue, though she felt a pang of worry. It wasn't often that her father ventured out of their safe little world. She sat back down, trying to focus on her book, but her thoughts kept drifting to the strange light. What if something had happened to her father? Or worse, what if it was something dangerous? John didn't look back as he made his way deeper into the woods, his footsteps crunching over the dry leaves and twigs. The light he had seen was just a memory now, but the sense of urgency lingered in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important was waiting for him. The woods weren't large, but the trees grew thick and tall, and it didn't take long before he found himself standing in a small clearing. That's when he saw it! A small, strange craft sat in the middle of the clearing, its sleek metallic surface reflecting the light of the setting sun. It was unlike anything John had ever seen before. It didn't look like a plane or any kind of military vehicle he could recognize. The shape was smooth, almost organic, with curves and angles that seemed unnatural. The craft was dented in places, as though it had endured a rough landing, but there was no sign of fire or smoke. It was eerily quiet. John approached cautiously, every instinct telling him to turn back. But something drew him in. The closer he got, the more he felt that this was no ordinary accident. The metal seemed to hum faintly, almost alive, as if it was waiting for him. And then, as if on cue, a small hatch opened, with a soft hiss. John stopped in his tracks, unsure of what to do. Was this a trap? Was someone inside? He was just about to turn and leave when he heard a sound. A soft, almost childish giggle. It wasn't what he had expected, and it made him freeze. The sound wasn't threatening. In fact, it was oddly comforting. It was the sound of something innocent, curious. He stepped forward once more, drawn by the sound, and looked inside the ship. What he saw made his heart stop. There, sitting on the floor of the craft, was a small figure, an alien child. Its skin was a shimmering shade of blue, and its eyes glowed with an almost otherworldly light. The creature was no taller than Emma, and it had delicate, almost ethereal features, like something out of a storybook. Its clothes were unlike anything John had ever seen, made of fabrics that shimmered and shifted colors with every movement. The child looked up at John with wide, curious eyes, as if it hadn't expected to see anyone at all. It tilted its head slightly, and then, in a voice that sounded like it was trying to form words, it said something John couldn't understand. The moment stretched out, and John's mind raced. What was happening? Was this real? Was this some kind of prank? The child was no larger than his own daughter, and yet it was clear that it didn't belong here. Its glowing eyes seemed to hold a kind of wisdom, but its mannerisms were innocent, almost childlike. It smiled at John, clearly unafraid, as if it had been waiting for him. John took a hesitant step forward. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice soft and unsure. The child giggled again, the sound almost musical. John had no idea what was going on, but there was one thing he knew for certain. This child needed help. Without thinking, John extended his hand toward the child. The alien seemed to study it for a moment before cautiously reaching out, its tiny hand wrapping around his fingers. It was warm to the touch, and John could feel the soft hum of energy radiating from the creature. "Come on," John said gently, his voice full of compassion. "Let's get you out of here." The alien child didn't resist. It simply followed him as he led it out of the strange craft and back toward the safety of his home. The woods felt suddenly much less inviting now, as though the world had shifted in a way that John couldn't yet understand. As they walked, John felt a strange sense of responsibility. He didn't know what this child was or where it had come from, but he knew it wasn't from Earth. The child's presence felt like a quiet secret, something the universe had entrusted to him. And though his mind raced with questions, all he could focus on was getting this innocent creature to safety. When they finally reached his home, Emma was standing at the door, waiting anxiously. Her eyes widened as she saw the strange child walking beside her father. She froze for a moment, unsure of what she was seeing. But then, just as her father had done, she instinctively knelt down, offering a friendly smile. John didn't know what this meant or what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. As John and the alien child approached their home, the evening light had begun to fade, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of Willow Creek. Emma, still standing on the porch, stared in disbelief at the small figure beside her father. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this child? Where had it come from? But before she could ask, John reached the porch and looked at her with a soft but serious expression. "Emma," he said gently, "this is—"
"Well, this is a friend. We need to help them."
Emma nodded slowly, her curiosity overwhelming her usual caution. She stepped closer to the child, her eyes wide as she took in the small, glowing figure standing beside her father. The creature had a calm, almost innocent presence, and Emma could sense that it wasn't dangerous. Yet, the feeling of unease lingered in the air. There was so much about this situation that didn't make sense. The child, noticing Emma's gaze, smiled and reached out a small hand. Its fingers were delicate, and its skin shimmered with an iridescent glow. The alien's eyes, large and expressive, seemed to communicate a kind of longing. The child looked at Emma with a kind of silent question, as though it was waiting for her to understand something that neither of them could yet put into words. Emma, her heart softening at the sight of the child's innocent expression, knelt down slowly. "Hi," she said softly, her voice calm but filled with wonder.
Are you okay? The alien giggled again, a sound that was both melodic and strangely human. It nodded and made a soft humming noise, as though it was trying to answer, but the words were beyond its reach.
Emma smiled, though she was unsure how to communicate with this small, glowing stranger. She glanced at her father, looking for some kind of direction, but John was just as unsure as she was. They had never faced anything like this before. "Let's get inside," John said, breaking the silence. "Balls." He turned and led the way into the house, the alien child following closely behind. Emma, still a little hesitant, moved to open the door, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the handle. She stepped aside to allow the child to enter first, but it hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. Inside, the house was warm and inviting, a sharp contrast to the confusion and strangeness of the situation. John set his jacket on the coat rack and motioned for the alien to sit at the kitchen table. He had no idea what to do next, but instinct told him that he needed to keep the child calm and safe. The small figure, still glowing softly, climbed into one of the chairs at the table and looked around curiously. Emma closed the door behind them and stood there, unsure of what to do. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but she didn't know where to start. The child seemed harmless, but it was so different from anything she had ever seen. She glanced at her father, but he too appeared deep in thought. John rubbed his forehead, trying to figure out how to approach this. This was no ordinary day. This was no ordinary visitor. "Dad, what do we do?" Emma asked, her voice trembling with a mix of wonder and fear. John looked at his daughter, his face serious but kind.
I don't know yet, Emma, but we'll figure it out.
He didn't know why he had brought the child in. Maybe it was because something in the child's eyes had reminded him of his own daughter, of the innocence that needed to be protected. Maybe it was because he knew deep down that the world was about to change in ways they couldn't understand. "I'll make some tea," John said, moving toward the kettle. He needed a moment to think. The situation was overwhelming, but he couldn't show his daughter that he was scared. She needed to see that everything was going to be okay, even if he wasn't sure how to make that happen. The alien child watched him closely, its eyes never leaving John. Then, it turned its gaze to Emma, who stood quietly, still trying to process everything. The child smiled again, and for a moment, it almost felt as though there was no barrier between them. A quiet understanding passed between them, a silent recognition that they were both in this strange moment, together. Emma's nerves settled slightly as she returned the smile, feeling a connection that was difficult to explain. John set the kettle down on the stove and looked back at the child. Do you need anything?" he asked. His voice was gentle, but he still wasn't sure if the child could even understand him. To his surprise, the alien nodded again, its eyes sparkling. Then, it did something unexpected. It raised its tiny hand, and with a soft sound, a small, shimmering orb of light appeared above it. The orb floated in the air, glowing brightly but not blindingly so. It was beautiful, like a tiny star, and it hovered just above the child's hand. Emma gasped in awe as she watched the orb move around, its light shifting in different colors with each motion. John stepped forward cautiously, watching the child's every move. "What is that?" he asked, almost in awe himself. The alien giggled again, a musical laugh that seemed to fill the room with warmth. It then moved the orb toward John, as though offering it to him. John hesitated, but then reached out with both hands, carefully cupping the glowing orb. As soon as he touched it, the light seemed to pulse softly, and a strange warmth spread through his palms. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was like holding a piece of the sun itself, soft and powerful at the same time.
"It's beautiful," Emma said quietly, her voice filled with wonder.
The child smiled and nodded, clearly pleased with their reaction. The orb floated gently back to its hand, where it began to shimmer again. Emma took a step closer, her curiosity growing. "What does it do?" she asked. The child tilted its head, as if trying to find a way to explain. It placed its hand on its chest and then pointed to Emma and John, making a gentle humming sound. "I think it's trying to communicate," John said softly, watching the child closely. "Maybe it doesn't have the words, but it's showing us something." Just then, the sound of a knock at the door interrupted the quiet moment. John's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the presence of the alien child was enough to make him nervous about anyone else showing up. He quickly moved to the door and peeked through the small window beside it. To his relief, it was just their neighbor, Mrs. Winters. She was an older woman who often came by to check on them, especially when she hadn't seen them out for a few days. John opened the door with a forced smile. "John, Emma, are you both okay?" Mrs. Winters asked, her voice laced with concern. "I thought I heard something unusual early. Is everything all right?" John hesitated for a moment, trying to think of a way to explain the strange situation without alarming her. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Winters," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. "Just a little visitor." Mrs. Winters raised an eyebrow. "A visitor? At this hour?" Before John could respond, the alien child appeared behind him, its eyes glowing softly in the dim light.
Mrs. Winters gasped, her hand going to her mouth in shock.
"Good heavens, John! What on earth is that?" The child tilted its head and gave Mrs. Winters a small wave. To John's surprise, Mrs. Winters didn't run away or scream. Instead, she blinked a few times, then took a cautious step forward, her curiosity overtaking her initial shock. Is it real?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. John nodded, his smile returning.
"Yes, it's real, but we don't know much about it yet."
I just want to keep it safe for now." Mrs. Winters studied the child carefully, her eyes narrowing with thought. "Safe? From who?" John paused. "I'm not sure yet." As they stood there, looking at each other, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. The world had just changed for both of them. John had no idea where this strange encounter would lead. But he knew one thing. He couldn't let this child go. He couldn't let it face whatever dangers lurked out there in the vastness of space alone. The evening wore on, and as the hours passed, the small house in Willow Creek began to feel like the center of a strange and unfamiliar world. The alien child, still glowing softly, had settled in at the kitchen table with Emma, who was now completely fascinated by the glowing orb that the child had shown her earlier. They had tried their best to communicate, but language was a barrier neither of them could cross just yet. It wasn't the usual kind of challenge that Emma faced, where she could simply read a book or ask a question to understand. This was different. This was something that defied everything she thought she knew. John had stepped outside briefly, just to collect his thoughts. He needed a moment to breathe. Everything was happening so fast. What was this child doing here? What were they supposed to do next? He couldn't get the thought of Mrs. Winters' shock out of his mind. She had reacted with curiosity, yes, but there was fear in her eyes, too. And the fear wasn't just for the strange child. It was the fear of the unknown.
John knew that kind of fear all too well. It was a fear of what might come next.
He was standing in the backyard now, looking out at the wide open spaces of Willow Creek. The grass swayed gently in the evening breeze, and the sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink from the setting sun. It was peaceful, a quiet place far from the chaos of the world. But tonight, the peacefulness felt wrong, out of place. Something was changing, and John could feel it deep in his bones. The sound of a door opening behind him made him turn. Emma stood in the doorway, her face pale, but her eyes were steady. "Dad," she said softly, "you need to see this." John followed her back inside, his heart thumping in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but something told him that the situation was getting more complicated by the minute. As he entered the kitchen, he saw that the alien child was no longer just sitting quietly. It was moving around the table, touching things, exploring in the way children do. But this wasn't a regular child. It was something else entirely. The child had found one of the family's old books that John had kept on a shelf. One of the many books Emma liked to read. The alien was turning the pages carefully, its glowing eyes focused on the words, even though it couldn't possibly understand them. Emma had tried earlier to teach the child a few words, but it hadn't been easy. The alien seemed to understand emotions more than words. It could sense kindness, confusion, curiosity, but the complexities of language were lost on it. John knelt down beside the child and gently took the book away. "That's not for you to play with right now," he said softly. "But I'll find you something else, all right?" The child looked up at him with a puzzled expression, its face like a mixture of wonder and confusion. John couldn't help but smile. Despite the situation, there was something almost childlike about the alien, something pure and innocent. It was hard to imagine that this little being was capable of things beyond human comprehension. Emma, who had been watching the exchange silently, stepped forward. "Dad," she said again, her voice a little stronger now. "We have to figure out where it came from." "What if people are looking for it? What if they come here?" What if? She stopped herself, not sure where her thoughts were going. John nodded slowly, his thoughts echoing her own fears. He didn't know what to think anymore. The child was so small, so fragile. It didn't seem dangerous. But John had a deep feeling in his gut that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than they could handle. "I'll call someone tomorrow," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll figure this out, Emma."
We'll get some answers. The next few hours were quiet.
John tried to distract himself by making dinner. He couldn't let his daughter see the worry that gnawed at him. He had always been the protector, the steady one. But now, as the alien child sat at their table, laughing softly at something only it seemed to understand, John realized just how much he didn't know, and it frightened him more than anything else ever had. Emma had tried talking to the alien child again, making gestures, trying to get a sense of its emotions. The alien would giggle and make strange, high-pitched noises, but its responses were always vague, as though it was still trying to piece together the world around it. Finally, after dinner, they all gathered in the living room. John sat on the couch, watching as Emma quietly tried to teach the alien child the alphabet. It was an odd thing to be doing, sitting in their living room with a glowing, otherworldly creature. But the child's curiosity seemed endless, and Emma was happy to oblige. She was so captivated by it, by the way the child seemed to absorb every bit of attention and affection. The alien child didn't seem dangerous, not to her, but the unease still lingered. John knew he couldn't keep the child hidden forever. Someone would come looking. The government, other aliens, maybe even the military. His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his phone. He jumped, startled, before picking it up.
Hello? It was Mrs. Winters.
"John, I need to talk to you, right now." John's heart dropped.
Is everything all right? I don't know, Mrs. Dyke.
Winters replied, her voice tight with concern. "There's been talk. People are starting to notice strange things. I don't want to cause trouble, but I think you need to be careful. This thing, whatever it is, it's not from here, and people are starting to ask questions. Some things are already out of our hands."
John's stomach twisted.
"What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady despite the panic rising in him. "I'm not sure," Mrs. Winters said.
But there's talk, John.
People are saying they saw a light, some kind of strange phenomenon. They've heard about a visitor. I don't know how much longer we can keep this quiet.
You need to figure out what's going on.
John hung up the phone, his mind racing. He couldn't ignore it any longer. There was no more hiding. Things were getting out of control. The next morning, John made a decision. He had to take action before things spiraled further. The first thing he did was make an appointment with a local government official who had served in the military. This wasn't something he could handle alone. This was something that needed answers, and he couldn't risk waiting until it was too late. The day dragged on as John and Emma prepared for what was coming. The alien child, oblivious to the human world's turmoil, sat quietly in the corner, playing with its glowing orb. Seemingly content, it had no idea that its very presence had begun to shift the delicate balance of life in Willow Creek. At noon, as John and Emma drove to the government office, they noticed something strange. A small group of cars was parked along the side of the road near the outskirts of town. People were standing outside, talking in hushed voices. A couple of them were looking up at the sky. John's eyes narrowed. He recognized a few of the people. They weren't the usual townsfolk. They were outsiders, strangers. He parked the car at the edge of the gathering, his heart racing. Emma looked at him, concerned, but didn't speak. They stepped out of the car, and as they approached, one of the men turned to them. His eyes locked onto John's, and something about his gaze made John feel uneasy.
We need to talk,
the man said, his voice calm but firm.
Where is it?
John's pulse quickened, and he glanced at Emma. She looked back at him, wide-eyed, but steady. She knew what was happening. The alien child, the secret they had been keeping, was no longer just their problem. It was bigger than that now, and no matter what they did, the truth would soon come out. The tension in Willow Creek had been building since the previous day. John couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. As he and Emma stood on the outskirts of the group, the stranger who had addressed them earlier took a step closer, his expression unreadable but intense.
His eyes flickered from John to Emma, sizing them up, as though deciding just how much to reveal.
We're not here to cause trouble,
the man said, his voice calm but firm.
We're just trying to figure out what happened.
Where is the child? John didn't answer immediately. His heart raced, but he remained calm on the outside. He glanced at Emma, who stood beside him, her eyes wide, but her posture steady. She was just as frightened as he was, but there was something in her demeanor that gave him strength.
I don't know what you're talking about,
John said finally, his voice neutral.
What child?
The man's lips tightened.
You know exactly what I mean. The one that crashed last night.
The one that isn't from here. He glanced nervously around at the small crowd of people, most of whom were still watching the sky, waiting for something. John felt his stomach drop. People had already seen the lights in the sky. They knew something had happened, and they were looking for answers. Emma stepped forward then, her voice clear and surprisingly strong for someone her age. "What do you want with the child?" she asked, her eyes focused on the stranger.
Why are you looking for them?
The man looked taken aback for a moment, clearly not expecting the question. He hesitated before answering, glancing at the others in the group before returning his gaze to John and Emma. "We're not the only ones looking," he said quietly. "There are others. Some of them are not as patient as we are." John felt a chill run down his spine. The man's words were cryptic, but the meaning was clear. There were people out there who wouldn't hesitate to take extreme measures to get what they wanted. And whatever it was that the child represented, it was something people were willing to go to great lengths to find.
What do you mean by others?
John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mind was already racing, trying to piece together the information he had. Who were these people? What was so important about the child? The man's gaze shifted to the sky again, his expression darkening. We're not the only ones aware of the child's arrival, he said. Some powerful forces have been watching. Forces that will stop at nothing to get what they want. John's heart skipped a beat. The last part of the man's words sounded like a warning, one that John didn't want to ignore. He knew that whatever was going on, the small alien child they had tried to protect was no longer just a curiosity or a strange event. It was a target. John looked back at Emma, who was holding his hand tightly. He had to protect her, protect the child. He couldn't let anything happen to either of them. He was already in too deep, but there was no turning back now. His decision was made.
We don't have the child, John said, his voice steady now, his resolve hardening.
And I don't know who you're working for, but you're not taking anyone from here. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment John thought he saw a flash of something dangerous in his gaze. But then the moment passed, and the stranger seemed to reconsider his approach. I'm not here to cause harm, the man said slowly. But you need to understand that the child's presence here has set off a chain of events. There are people who will not stop until they have the child. If you have any sense of self-preservation, you'll bring them to us. Now. John's breath caught in his throat. The threat was clear. But it wasn't just the man standing before him who posed a danger. The others, the ones who were lurking in the shadows, would be far worse. He had no idea who they were or what they were capable of. But he knew they would stop at nothing to find the alien child.
We're not giving them up,
John said, his voice firm. We'll protect them no matter what. The man studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his options. Finally he sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat.
I didn't want it to come to this, he muttered, but you leave me no choice. Before John could react, the man turned and raised a hand, signaling to the others.
The crowd began to disperse, some moving toward their cars, others fading into the trees. John's heart pounded in his chest. Something was happening, and it wasn't good.
Emma,
he said, his voice low.
Get inside. Lock the doors.
Don't open them for anyone. Emma nodded quickly and hurried toward the house. John followed her, but before he reached the door, a loud, distant sound caught his attention. It was a low hum, like something large and powerful moving through the air. He turned back to the road and saw a sleek, dark shape descending from the sky. It was fast, too fast for any conventional aircraft. His heart raced as the craft landed not far from where he stood. The door to the house slammed shut behind him as Emma rushed inside, and John watched as the craft touched down on the ground. His stomach churned. This was no ordinary vehicle. It was something far beyond anything Earth had ever seen. The sound of the craft's engines faded, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Then the hatch opened, and figures began to emerge. John's breath hitched. They were tall, humanoid figures, but their features were different from anything human. Their skin shimmered with an unnatural sheen, their eyes dark and calculating. They moved with an unsettling grace, their presence commanding and intimidating. John knew, in that moment, that these weren't ordinary humans. They were from the same place as the alien child. They were part of the same strange and dangerous world. The figures approached John, their eyes scanning him with cold precision. He didn't back away, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to run. He had to protect Emma. He had to protect the child. One of the figures, taller than the rest, stepped forward.
We have come for what is ours, it said, its voice smooth and unyielding. The child.
Hand them over.
John clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. He wasn't going to let them take the child. He wasn't going to let them destroy everything he had fought to protect.
You're not taking anyone, he said, his voice low but filled with determination. The alien's eyes narrowed.
You do not understand the consequences of your actions, it said coldly. The child is of great importance. To refuse us is to invite destruction upon your world. John felt his heart skip a beat. He had no idea what they wanted, but the threat was unmistakable. These beings were not here to negotiate. They were here for one reason only: to take what they believed was theirs. John's mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this situation. He couldn't let them hurt Emma. He couldn't let them hurt the child. But the odds were stacked against him, and he knew it. The alien forces were strong. They had technology and power beyond anything Earth could defend against.
I don't care who you are,
John said, his voice rising now.
This is our home.
We won't let you take anything. The alien figure studied him for a long moment, its gaze cold and calculating. Finally, it spoke again, its voice laced with something akin to regret. We were hoping it wouldn't come to this, the alien said.
But you have forced our hand. Prepare yourself.
Without warning, the alien raised its hand, and the air around John seemed to pulse with energy. A powerful force surged through the air, pushing against him, knocking him off his feet. He struggled to stay upright, but the force was too much. His vision blurred, and his breath came in short, painful gasps. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the force stopped. John collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The alien figures loomed over him, their faces unreadable. He was certain that this was the end. He had tried to protect his family, tried to protect the child, but he had failed. The aliens were too powerful. There was no way he could fight them. But just as the alien raised its hand to strike again, a voice broke through the tension. It was soft, but firm, filled with hope and defiance. No. John looked up, and for the first time since this nightmare had started, he felt a spark of hope. The alien child, standing at the door, was glowing brighter than ever before. Its small hand was raised, and the energy in the air seemed to bend around it. The child had power. The alien figures paused, their eyes flickering toward the child, confusion and fear flashing across their faces. The child's eyes burned with intensity, and its voice rang out, clear and strong, though it wasn't speaking in words that John could understand. But John understood the message. It wasn't the aliens who controlled the situation now. The child had made its choice. And in that moment, John realized that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than any of them could have ever imagined.